in the 17th century was the scientific revolution. There had been a steadily increasing progress in knowledge, which began before and has continued after the 17th century, but it was during this century that our basic ideas of the world were overturned, from a picture that was essentially the same as that of the Greek philosophers before Christ that began this podcast, from that to the one that we recognize as modern. Before that, we thought that the world was in the center and there were transparent spheres containing the planets and the stars, and they were all turning around, and many other things, that there were 4 elements: earth, fire, water, and which one have I missed? Oh no. And that there were 4 elements: earth, fire, water, and air. By the end of the century, people thought in terms of matter, force, energy, the chemical elements, the laws of motion, the scientific method. Now, it's worth talking about the scientific method for a minute. For the first time, the so-called controlled experiment was thought up. For example, if you think that putting a certain kind of manure on your fields gives you better crops, people had kind of done things, but the scientific method was you get 2 fields, you plant them, you check that they've got the same soil, you plant them with the same crop, and on one field you put the new manure, and on the other field you don't. And if you keep everything else the same, then if there's a difference, then it's almost certainly due to the change you made. Now, that might seem obvious to us now, but that was a systematic way of bringing new knowledge. And every time new knowledge comes, you can use that to develop more knowledge. And that's why our explosion of knowledge in the physical world, that's where it came from, the invention of the scientific method. And that began in the 17th century. Likewise, medicine had hardly changed since the time of Aristotle, 4th century BC. And mathematics had not really developed for 1,000 years. People had been busy with other things, and as so often happens, and as I mentioned perhaps briefly, the 5th century BC was when all the world seemed to wake up, and all these great spiritual leaders came. Likewise, in science, we find again and again, nothing happens for centuries, then 2 people think of the same thing at the same time. And mathematics took a great step forward with the invention of calculus, which is the basis of our modern engineering, by 2 people, Newton and Leibniz. Newton in England and Leibniz in France, although his name is German. And the figures of the scientific revolution are too numerous to mention, but I'll give an honourable mention to Copernicus, Tycho or Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, Isaac Newton, and Leibniz. It's claimed by some that the scientific revolution was part of an abandonment of the faith, but all of the above were devout in their faith. This is another lie. I won't talk about Galileo's problems, but they were not scientific problems. They were personal issues, personalities, but we will not discuss it in these brief notes. And I must also mention, not all historians of science are agreed that there was any revolution in the 16th or 17th century. They say there was rapid development, but perhaps revolution is too strong a word. If you take a good interest in history, I leave that for you to decide. In the middle of the 17th century, Oliver Cromwell arrived in Ireland. His armies were more brutal than anything since the barbarian invasions. Almost half of the entire native population perished. In the first town he attacked, Drogheda, he ordered every man, woman and child to be killed, to terrify the rest of the Irish, but they never gave in. And in the last decade, 1690, was the Battle of the Boyne, in which the Catholic army under the Stuart King James was defeated by the Protestant army under King William of Orange. The battle was not simply about who would rule Ireland, it was about which side would control Europe. and at the very end of the 17th century the penal laws were enacted. These took away all rights from Catholics and from nonconformists in Ireland.